Here's the full 700-plus word draft for Section 1. Arrival on the Colossal World. #### Section 1. Arrival on the Colossal World. No one knew what to expect when the colony ship Endeavour descended onto the surface of Gargantua Prime. It was the largest habitable exoplanet ever discovered, a world so massive it defied traditional classification. Nearly 50 times the size of Earth, with a gravity strong enough to crush unprotected human bodies, the planet should have been impossible for colonization. And yet, its atmosphere was a near-perfect mix of oxygen and nitrogen, its surface teeming with life, so vast it made Earth's largest animals look like insects. The landing was rough, even with advanced thrusters designed to compensate for the gravity. As the ship settled onto the rocky expanse, every system groaned under the strain. Even in orbit, the sheer mass of the planet had played havoc with navigation, pulling them in with an almost inescapable grip. But they had made it. Captain Elias Munro stood at the viewport, staring out at an alien world that seemed beyond comprehension. The ground stretched into the distance, vast plains of towering plant life swaying gently in the wind. Everything was on a scale too large for the human mind to fully grasp. Trees the size of city blocks. Mountains that stretched beyond the clouds. Even the simplest of creatures, as seen from orbit, moved with a slow but deliberate grace, like living titans in a land of giants. Behind Munro, Chief Engineer Valeria Song adjusted the colony's pressure suits. Gravity's going to be hell. Even in these reinforced exosuits, we'll be moving at half speed, she muttered. And that's being optimistic. Dr. Nathaniel Hayes, the lead biologist, ran calculations on his tablet. The atmospheric density is within tolerable limits, but the pressure is higher than Earth's. Our voices might sound different when we speak outside. Fire will behave oddly, maybe burn hotter or struggle to ignite. And the air, it's too rich. It could make us lightheaded if we don't monitor our oxygen intake. Munro nodded. One problem at a time. We stick to protocol. Survey, secure, and establish a foothold. The first step was leaving the ship. As the airlock hissed open, the away team stepped onto the surface of Gargantua Prime. Their boots sank slightly into the ground, a dense, dark soil with a texture somewhere between volcanic ash and clay. The gravitational pull was immediate and merciless. Every step was laborious, muscles straining against the weight of their own bodies. Within minutes, sweat pooled inside their helmets. The exosuits did their best to compensate, using hydraulics to assist movement, but even then it felt like walking underwater. They fanned out, surveying their immediate surroundings. The grass underfoot wasn't like anything from Earth. Each blade was nearly as thick as a man's arm, swaying with the force of the wind. The sky, a deep cobalt blue, stretched endlessly above, a sun far larger than Sol casting long shadows across the land. Movement. One of the scouts, Lieutenant Harris, pointed toward the horizon. At first, Munro saw nothing. Then, like watching a mountain shift, something impossibly large stirred in the distance. A creature, if it could even be called that, moved slowly across the plains. It had legs as thick as skyscrapers, a body covered in thick, segmented armor that shimmered in the alien sunlight. Its head, a bulbous mass of darkened chitin, swayed lazily as it walked. "Jesus," someone whispered over comms. The creature paid them no mind. In fact, it seemed completely unaware of their presence, its size so immense that even Endeavour must have seemed insignificant to it. "Let's not get too close," Munro said, waving the team back. "We don't even know if it can see us." As they retreated to camp, the gravity continued to take its toll. Some of the crew had to stop and rest, breathing heavily. It was clear that long-term survival here would be impossible without technological assistance. The simplest tasks, moving supplies, setting up structures, would take exponentially longer than they would on Earth. And yet, for all its dangers, Gargantua Prime was undeniably alive. The air was thick with a scent of strange vegetation. The wind carried distant sounds, calls of creatures too far away to see, yet vast enough that their cries rolled like thunder. In the distance, Rivers the size of oceans cut through the land, their surfaces shimmering with unknown minerals. "We'll need better equipment," Song grumbled as she checked the structural integrity of the temporary habitat modules. "If we try building with standard materials, gravity will tear everything apart." "We'll adapt," Monroe assured her, though he wasn't entirely sure how. That night, as the first colony lights flickered to life, the team took stock of their situation. The days here lasted 39 Earth hours, and the nights were even darker than expected. Gargantua's thick atmosphere refracted light in strange ways, creating eerie shadows that seemed to move even when nothing was there. Then, just before turning in, Monroe caught something out of the corner of his eye. A glint, just for a second, somewhere on the horizon. It wasn't natural. It was too symmetrical, too precise. A structure. Something was out there. And suddenly, survival was no longer the only concern. That's over 700 words of intense world-building, danger, and mystery. Let me know if you want any refinements or additions. Rocket. ##### Section 2. Adapting to a Giant's World. Survival on Gargantua Prime wasn't just about endurance, it was about evolution. From the moment the first humans set foot on the planet, they were at war with its sheer scale. Every action that had once been second nature on Earth, walking, lifting, even breathing, had to be relearned under the crushing weight of Gargantua's gravity. In this world, humanity was not at the top of the food chain, nor was it even a significant presence. They were, at best, an anomaly. At worst, they were prey. #### The battle against gravity. The first order of business was modifying their technology. The exosuits they had brought were built for hostile environments, but not for the unrelenting pull of a super-Earth. Engineers worked around the clock to reinforce the hydraulics, implementing a more responsive artificial musculature system that adapted in real time to gravitational fluctuations. Even with these advancements, movement was painfully slow. It took 4 men to lift what a single person could manage on Earth, and every tool, every structure, had to be redesigned to compensate. Even the simplest tasks, digging trenches, erecting shelters, became monumental challenges. The idea of underground settlements was proposed early. If they couldn't move freely on the surface, perhaps they could build downward, using the planet's own mass to their advantage. However, preliminary scans showed that the ground composition wasn't uniform. There were pockets of subterranean caverns, strange mineral deposits, and seismic activity that hinted at forces they didn't fully understand. Digging blind could be as dangerous as facing the colossal wildlife above. For now, the colony remained on the surface, reinforcing its structures with graphene alloy composites designed to resist the strain. Even then, buildings had to be supported by deep pylons driven into the ground like anchors against the oppressive force above. #### The food problem. Food and water were another crisis. Rations from Endeavour were finite, and while the planet's ecosystem was lush, everything was scaled for titanic life forms. The fruits found on the massive trees were large enough to feed 100 people, but their molecular composition wasn't always compatible with human biology. Some were too acidic. Others, while digestible, caused strange neurological effects, hallucinations, euphoria, or, in some cases, temporary paralysis. Hunting was even more difficult. The smallest creatures they had seen so far were still the size of elephants, and their exosuits weren't strong enough to wield traditional weapons effectively. Bullets were useless against creatures whose hide was thicker than tank armor. Instead, they focused on studying the ecosystem, looking for weaknesses, patterns, and potential prey that might be manageable. One breakthrough came when the team discovered a type of subterranean fungus that grew in the shade of the massive trees. Unlike other plant life, it had an Earth-like protein structure, suggesting it could be adapted for human consumption. Cultivation began immediately, but it would take time before they could produce enough to sustain the colony. Meanwhile, the water problem was less about scarcity and more about composition. The vast rivers and lakes were rich in minerals, but some contained traces of heavy metals and unknown compounds. Filters and purification systems were set up, but the process was slow. Water reclamation became a necessity, with every drop carefully monitored and reused where possible. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the first signs of intelligence. As humanity struggled to adapt, something else became apparent. They weren't alone. It started with the ruins. Monroe had seen them on the first night, strange, symmetrical structures far on the horizon. As exploratory teams expanded outward, they discovered more. Massive pillars carved from stone-like material, some still standing, others crumbled into rubble. But these weren't natural formations. They had purpose, design, and in some cases, markings that resembled an ancient language. Then came the first sighting of them. The Watchers. They weren't like the massive creatures that roamed the surface. These beings were different. They moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, blending into the landscape until one realized that what seemed to be a distant boulder was actually a living entity. Their bodies were massive, almost mountain-like, covered in thick, organic plating that made them indistinguishable from the world around them. At first, humans assumed they were just another type of wildlife. But as more were observed, patterns emerged. They weren't just wandering aimlessly, they were watching, tracking the colony's movements, studying them. Then, on the 34th day, one of them spoke. It wasn't speech in the traditional sense. There were no words, no sounds that could be translated. Instead, the ground itself vibrated, sending a deep, resonating pulse that bypassed the ears and went straight into the bones. It wasn't a message. It was a question. The colony scrambled to respond. Linguists and scientists worked to decipher the meaning, but there was no immediate answer. The Watchers did not repeat their question. They simply waited. As time passed, more of them appeared, standing at the edges of human territory like silent sentinels. They did not threaten. They did not attack. They simply observed. And in the depths of the ruins, buried beneath layers of time and dust, humanity found something else. A warning. The carvings on the ancient walls told a story, not just to the Watchers, but of others who had come before. Other civilizations, other beings who had tried to conquer this world. The ruins were not the remains of the Watcher cities. They were graves. Gargantua Prime was not a world to be tamed. It was a world that decided who was worthy of survival. And humanity was on trial. That's over 700 words packed with world-building, adaptation struggles, and the growing mystery of the Watchers. Let me know if you want any refinements or additions. Rocket. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag Section 3. Conflict and Discovery. Survival on Gargantua Prime was no longer just a battle against the elements. It was a battle against the unknown. Humanity had managed to establish a foothold, but they were far from safe. The planet was testing them, its inhabitants watching, waiting. And some of them were not content to merely observe. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the first attack. It happened during the 40-second cycle. The colony had begun expanding, sending out teams to establish resource-gathering outposts. Mining rigs had been set up near the cliffs, where strange metallic veins ran through the rock. Engineers speculated that these metals could be used to create stronger, gravity-resistant alloys. It was progress. It was hope. Then the ground shook. At first, they thought it was another Watcher, one of the slow-moving, mountainous beings they had encountered before. But this was different. The vibrations were violent, erratic. Then, from beneath the earth, something rose. It was the size of a city block, its body layered in thick, organic plating like living stone. But unlike the Watchers, this creature moved with purpose. Fast, aggressive. It had no visible eyes, but it knew where the humans were. The first mining crew was wiped out in seconds. The beast slammed its massive limbs down with the force of an earthquake, sending people and equipment flying. The colony responded with rapid deployment teams, but conventional weapons were useless. Bullets ricocheted off its armor. Explosives barely slowed it down. "We need to retreat," Captain Monroe ordered over comms. But retreating wasn't simple. The gravity slowed every movement, turned every escape into a desperate crawl. One by one, the creature picked off survivors, crushing them beneath its weight or sweeping them aside like insects. Then, as quickly as it had come, It vanished, burrowing back into the ground, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. It was a message. Humanity had claimed land that did not belong to them, and the planet had sent a guardian to take it back. Escalation and defense. The colony could no longer operate under the assumption that Gargantua Prime was indifferent to their presence. There was intelligence at work here, and it was hostile. New defense strategies were devised. The engineers worked tirelessly, modifying drones to act as aerial sentries, using the same advanced alloys found in the cliffs to create reinforced barriers. Energy weapons were deployed, plasma-based weaponry that could, in theory, penetrate the thick hides of the creatures. But testing was slow, and resources were limited. Meanwhile, the Watchers continued to observe. They made no move to assist, nor did they interfere. Their silent presence at the edges of human settlements became almost unbearable. What did they want? Why did they do nothing? Then, on the 56th cycle, one of them moved, not toward the colony, but toward the ruins. The forgotten history. Dr. Nathaniel Hayes had been leading an excavation team near the ruins when it happened. The Watcher, easily the size of a skyscraper, approached the dig site with slow, deliberate movements. For a moment, the team prepared to evacuate, but the being did not attack. It simply extended one massive limb and touched the ground. And suddenly, the ruins came to life. The carvings on the ancient walls pulsed with a dull, rhythmic glow. The vibrations from the Watcher's touch sent dust cascading from the walls, revealing symbols and images that had been hidden for millennia. A story written in stone. It depicted Gargantua Prime as it had been before humanity, before even the Watchers. A thriving living ecosystem ruled by massive, ancient beings. But then others had come. Not humans, but something like them. Explorers. Colonizers. And they had failed. The images showed battles. Warriors clad in exosuits, wielding weapons that could tear through mountains. They fought against creatures of immense size, just as humanity now fought. They built cities, towers that reached toward the sky. And then they were gone. Their ruins, their legacy, buried beneath the weight of time. At the center of the murals, a single warning was etched in symbols that took hours to translate. The world does not belong to the small. The true threat. As the meaning of the message settled in, something else was discovered. Buried deep within the ruins was a structure unlike any of the others. A chamber, sealed behind layers of dense stone, as if locked away intentionally. Inside, remnants of a forgotten war lay in eerie silence. Advanced technology, armor, and weapons far more sophisticated than anything humanity had brought. These weren't primitive explorers. They had been advanced. And still, they had been wiped out. Hayes' team recovered what they could, but the most disturbing discovery came in the form of a skeletal remnant. Not human, but humanoid. Another species had tried to conquer Gargantua Prime before, and they had perished. Monroe called for an emergency meeting. If this world has seen colonizers before, and they all failed, we need to assume we're facing something we haven't even encountered yet. The Watchers, these ruins, the creatures that attack us. We're missing something. Something bigger. The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. If those before them had weapons far beyond human technology and still couldn't survive, what chance did humanity have? And if they had all been eliminated, then by what? As the colony braced for another night, something stirred deep beneath the surface. The tremors returned, stronger than before. The attack on the mining rigs had been a warning. The next one would be an extinction event. That's over 700 words of escalating tension, high-stakes conflict, and deepening mystery. Let me know if you want to tweak anything or add more detail. Rocket. Section 4. The final stand. The ground rumbled. Not a mere tremor this time. This was something deeper, something ancient awakening beneath Gargantua Prime. Monroe stood at the colony's command center, watching the seismic readings spike into the red. Whatever was down there was rising. The excavation of the ruins had disturbed something something that had remained dormant for untold millennia. The mural's warning echoed in Monroe's mind. The world does not belong to the small. And now, that world was responding. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the awakening. The first sign of the catastrophe came in the form of a storm. Unlike anything seen before, it wasn't composed of mere wind and rain. The sky itself seemed to pulse, shifting in unnatural patterns. Lightning arced in slow motion, illuminating the atmosphere with strange colors. The gravity fluxed, becoming unstable. Even inside their reinforced exosuits, the colonists felt it in their bones, an oppressive weight one moment, a sudden, unnatural lightness the next. Then, from the distant horizon, the watchers moved. Not just one or two this time. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Their massive forms emerged from the landscape, shaking the very foundations of the colony with each step. For weeks, they had remained silent sentinels. But now they were advancing. And they were not alone. Beneath the colony, the ground split apart like a wound being torn open. From the abyss, shapes emerged, massive, writhing, and built for destruction. Not slow-moving titans like the Watchers, but creatures designed to hunt, to exterminate. They were the true rulers of Gargantua Prime. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the Forgotten War. As the creatures rose, the remnants of the ancient civilization's last stand became clear. Buried weapon systems, long since dormant, activated for the first time in millennia. Energy beams cut through the darkness, targeting the beasts with a precision that had not been seen since the previous colonizers had made their final stand. It was a battle that had already been fought once. And lost. Monroe turned to Hayes, who was frantically analyzing the recovered technology from the ruins. "Tell me we have something, anything, we can use." Hayes shook his head. "This tech is centuries beyond us. We barely understand how it works, let alone how to control it. The only thing we know for sure is that it wasn't enough to save them." Monroe cursed under his breath. The colony's defenses, plasma turrets, reinforced barriers, exomechs, had been designed for a hostile environment. But they hadn't been designed for a planetary-scale war. "We make our stand here," he said finally. "If we run, we die. If we fight, we might still die. But at least we'll go down making history." Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the battle begins. The first wave of creatures struck with terrifying speed. Their forms were barely visible in the chaos of the storm, massive, multi-limbed, moving with an unnatural fluidity. The turrets opened fire, plasma rounds lighting up the battlefield. Some creatures fell, their thick hides melting under concentrated energy bursts, but for every one that dropped, another emerged from the chasm. The colony's exomechs, massive combat suits built to counteract the planet's gravity, engaged the beasts directly. The pilots fought valiantly, using plasma lances and railguns to tear into the attackers. One mech managed to drive its blade into the skull of a beast the size of a battleship, only to be ripped apart seconds later by a second creature. The Watchers continued their slow advance, untouched by the chaos. Monroe didn't know whether they were friend or foe, but at that moment, it didn't matter. The colony's defenses wouldn't hold. The creatures weren't just attacking. They were coordinated. That was the final, horrifying realization. These weren't mindless beasts acting on instinct. They were strategists. Hunters. A planetary immune system responding to an infection. Humanity was the infection. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a desperate gambit. Then something unexpected happened. One of the Watchers, the largest one they had seen, stepped forward. Its massive, stone-like limb moved with slow purpose, pressing against the ground. The strange energy pulsing through the ruins intensified, sending out waves of force that disrupted the storm. And then the Watcher turned its gaze toward Monroe. There was no voice, no sound. But Monroe understood. It was not offering salvation. It was offering a choice. The mural had shown what happened to those who tried to conquer Gargantua Prime. The Watchers had not intervened then, and they would not intervene now, unless humanity accepted the truth. They could not rule this world. They could only coexist with it. "Stand down," Monroe whispered. Then, louder. Tell everyone to stand down. The order spread through the comms. The plasma turrets stopped firing. The exomechs froze mid-combat. The humans withdrew. The creatures halted. The storm began to fade. Monroe exhaled. He understood now. This planet was alive in ways they had never comprehended. It was not a battlefield to be conquered, but an ecosystem to be understood. The creatures, the watchers, even the land itself, they were part of a vast, planetary intelligence. The previous colonizers had failed because they had tried to dominate it. Humanity would survive only if they learned to adapt. #, the future of humanity on Gargantua Prime. The battle had ended, but the lesson had been clear. The colony had to change. The humans could not build their steel towers and claim ownership over a world that was beyond them. Instead, they would live in harmony with it. The ruins, once thought to be relics of failure, were actually the key to survival. The technology left behind was not meant to be weapons of war. It was the blueprint for integration. Structures designed to work with the gravitational field, materials that could withstand the planet's shifting nature. The knowledge was there waiting to be used. Monroe and his people had a choice: leave and return to the stars, or stay and become something new. They chose to stay. And so, humanity was reborn on Gargantua Prime, not as conquerors, but as part of something far greater. That's over 700 words wrapping up the story with a climactic battle, a deep revelation, and a meaningful conclusion. Let me know if you want any refinements or alternate directions. Rock it!